I'm making this video to discuss the clouded boundary issue between my house at 32 Lincoln Street and my neighbor's house next door. The original house was built in 1947. In fact, all these houses roughly in this neighborhood, including my neighbor's, were built back in 1947 when Dow Air Force Base was being constructed. And my neighbor purchased his house from his parents in 1979. My parents purchased this house from a couple by the name of the Bissels in 1981. There were no known issues with the boundary that I can find anywhere. In 2009, my mom passed away and left me the house, and shortly thereafter, because I had taken care of her for 6 years, from 2003 to 2009, I had a surveyor come in and survey the boundaries because I was curious. And in fact, I had a survey stake placed right there. And what I found out was that the boundary actually runs from that stake at an angle and slices into the back part of my house, cuts through the Bilko door, which we'll see in a minute, and goes out into the woods. This extension here that I'm pointing to was added in 1957 by the Bissels, and obviously no one really knew where the boundary was, even though the original boundary survey that was done in 1946 was valid, but nobody actually had one done. And when they were adding this extension, there was no issue in 1957. Nobody complained about part of this house and whatever being on my neighbor's property. So I'm walking back here. These granite slabs were put here by my father back in 1982, shortly after the house was purchased, and basically it was to keep the water from coming down off the roof and eroding this little area here. The last 3 or 4 of those are actually on my neighbor's property, but these stones have been in place since my dad put them in. Walking back, that stump that we're looking at, I cut that tree down because it was getting too close to the house and actually almost covering that window in 2006, thinking that it was on my property. And my neighbor obviously saw it at one point and had said nothing, because he again assumed that the property line, like everybody else, ran somewhere between here or perhaps down this tree line, but nobody knew for sure. My father would mow this line right down here. In fact, I have photos showing where he mowed. The photos are actually taken from over here, looking this way. In 1982 or 3, shortly after Mom and Dad moved in, they had 3 Dobermans, and they needed a dog run for them. So they put in, back then it was a tall wire mesh fence, which I have pictures of. And it pretty much, the footprint started here, went right down there, and then basically went over there. And over the years, that fence was upgraded to a chain link fence, and then eventually to a white vinyl fence similar to the one that you see there. There was no problems, no issues with the neighbor. in regards to the fence being on his property. I moved the fence back in probably 2009 or 8, roughly. I had it moved back to its current location at the request of my neighbor to be accommodating. I never should have done that. In 1991 or 2, I have evidence that this Bilco door was added, and this whole area here was actually built up. Of course, they had to be dug out, and again, part of this right down through there is on my neighbor's property. But because no one knew the property lines were, for sure, there was no objection or discussion about it that I can find. These stones were put here by my father to help keep this build-up area here from eroding. My mother planted this tree here. This big tree, which I think is a maple, has been here for probably 30-40 years. Mom planted the tree beyond it. Not sure where that tree come from there. I think it was just probably grew up on it, grew from a seed or something. But I had a tree expert from University of Maine come and do date these trees here, and roughly this one here would have been planted, he said, back probably in the mid-80s. He estimated the age. This one here obviously been around for a long time, and this one here probably is a slow-growing tree that's been around probably 15 or 20 years, he said. Walking back here, what I think probably happened was there is, in the woods here a little bit, there is a boundary line marker that has been here. It's right there. And I think everybody assumed that it was the boundary line between the two houses. But in fact, this is actually a boundary marker for the house behind me here. So if you turn around and look back, you can pretty much see that the boundary marker follows the tree line. So back in the days, in the 50s or so, I think these tree lines were perhaps used as an indicator of where the boundary line was. It would have been that big tree probably, and probably this one here back in those days. The actual boundary marker for my property is right in there. I'm pointing to it right there. It's got the yellow tip on it. That is the actual marker. There was no marker there in 2009. I don't think there was any evidence of any marker there, according to my surveyor, so I had him place that in that position. Swinging around, just looking again at you can see the proximity of the two houses. I actually have photos taken from this yard, this backyard here, going back into the 80s, showing these trees when they were much younger, showing where my father used to mow, and all these activities were taking place notoriously in the open in a manner that would give anyone the impression that this was actually all the land that went with 32 Lincoln Street. The unfortunate thing is that as long as the boundary is clouded, neither property is worth anything on the market. My neighbor and I tried to work this out. In fact, when I told my neighbor about it in 2009, he said we could work it out, not to worry and everything. So I did the footwork with the city, and I had an attorney do some research for me, and basically the city said that we could work out an equal swap of land here. We couldn't buy or sell from each other, and then once that was determined, what was fair between the two of us, we could go before the City of Brewer Board of Appeals for a zoning change, and we could get the boundary line changed. I had my neighbor come here, and he measured off what he felt was fair, and he drew it out, and it worked for me and it worked for him. It gave me room to do maintenance on the side of my house without going over on his property line, such as replacing the siding or whatever, putting up ladders, and it was all worked out. I got up to the point where I was ready to go before the Board of Appeals, and I received an email from him where he said he had consulted with attorneys, real estate people, and others, and they said if he went ahead with this, that it would devalue his property, and therefore he insisted that I tear down part of my house, which monetarily wise, since I'm on a limited income, would have been cost prohibitive. I am guessing probably $30,000 to tear off the corner of that house and dig up the foundation and move the Bilco door to the other side and everything that entails. So we ended up having attorneys get involved, and we've tried to come to a consensus. That's been a very slow progress over the last couple of years. Right now it has stalled. I've tried to reach him through his attorney to get things moving again, but I am not getting anything back from him. My neighbor has rented this house now for a couple of years, so he's not physically here that much, but he does drop by on occasion. In fact, there's a new tenant getting ready to move in another week or so, I believe. So that's where we are, and the sad thing is that neither one of these houses can be put on the market unless this is disclosed to the realtor, and of course the banks will not loan money on a mortgage as long as the boundary is clouded. So market-wise, these houses right now are worth nothing, and this issue will stay this way. In fact, should I pass away and I leave this house to somebody, they're going to run into the same issue. They will inherit the problem. If it is sold and the money goes to my estate, it's still going to be a problem to somebody, because no one's going to buy it with a clouded boundary. So it's very important that we get this resolved. At this point, the only resolution I see is adverse possession, which clearly I do have a case, according to my attorney, but that is a very expensive and time-consuming process, and I really can't afford to do that right now. And I don't think he could afford to fight it, actually. So it's in the best interest for both of us to work this issue out amicably and probably go back to the original plan that we had, that the city was going to agree to. But obviously he's looking at the money and the value of his property as opposed to getting this issue resolved, when in effect his refusal to go along with the original agreement that he and I hammered out is actually causing the clouded boundary issue, and it's going to stay that way until we somehow work this out. If I had the money, I would probably take him to court. It's a very expensive process, and I just can't afford to do it. So I'm hoping that we can come to some sort of resolution between ourselves to go back to the original equal swap of land agreement, which I think had a chance of getting through the city without great expense to either one of us.